Sunday, the 31st of May. Good evening and welcome to the Fourth Estate. My name is Raymond Mujini. Here's a look at the stories that we have our eyes on today. In the stories that we're looking at, the Daily Monitor takes on a fresh look with a redesign. We also look at the new contact cases that are rising the number of community cases on the Uganda COVID-19 tally. We also talk to journalist Walter Mwesije on covering the post-COVID lockdown. In the COVID-19 tally sheet, when numbers are being counted, there's two sets of cases that Uganda has been receiving. Those are the truck drivers and the community cases. For a long time, the community cases have been on a hold, but this week, those numbers started to go up. One of the truck drivers, it is rumored, was in touch with members of the community and sparked off a rise in community cases. This week, we talked to Walter Mwesije, a health journalist at NTV, about what those community cases mean and how the media has been covering them. With each tipping night, the anxious wait for the national tally of COVID-19 cases gets stronger. From the last Sunday, when the national tally hung at 175 cases, to the recent tally of Saturday at 413 cases, the record of contact cases and their meteoric rise has become a staple for the press. The Monitor, New Vision, The Observer,
Some were foreigners. We think that those foreigners could have gone back, but some, still we cannot rule out that some went somewhere, and we shall continue to endeavor to look for them. For now, our main effort is to get as many contacts, even the contacts of the contacts, make sure that we quarantine them and maintain minimal infections in the community.
One of the things that you covered this week was the first report into the patients of COVID-19 in Uganda. You had an exclusive interview with a doctor who carried out that research. How important was that research in understanding COVID-19 for the newsroom?
Yeah, what the explanation the doctor gave is that characterization of COVID-19 is key, particularly the virus. And of course, you know that UVRI is going further to break it down and to understand its DNA as the virus. And of course, this would help them understand response to treatment, how much it would affect somebody who falls ill in terms of looking at, for example, the lungs, because all these SARS viruses, affect the respiratory system much more than any other body organ. But of course, in turn later, many other organs like the liver, the kidneys could also be affected. But the lungs, and in the report, it actually, was revealed that 2 patients had extensive lung damage, and one of them is still on treatment for that. It takes quite a while, like the doctor said, but they believe that it will be, very key in terms of finding the utmost treatment for a given patient.
When the COVID-19 story had just broken out, there was a lot of anxiety in terms of we need ICU beds to be able to take care of patients of COVID-19. But the research findings that you've been presented with the doctor that you saw, shows that only 2 patients of Uganda's over hundreds of cases now have required ICU treatment. Is that something that now looks peculiar to you as a health journalist?
Yeah, well, that finding, of course, moves along with the fact that most of the people who are infected are, unlike in the other countries that are suffering big hits in terms of deaths registered. Africa generally has not received that much of deaths, and the reason is that many of the people, according to the findings of the report, were middle-aged people. If you look at the average age of the first 56 patients, is 33 years, and the doctors think that 33 you're still able-bodied, your body system and what they call it, immunity, your immunity is still strong. So that's why we have not seen anybody go into that kind of critical mode where you'd finally want ventilation or even be put in ICU.
In terms of understanding COVID-19, what does this report play as a role in understanding the COVID-19 story in Uganda?
Yeah, and I would like to also let you know that the findings for now are just partial, because it's an extensive study that is going to continue even after today. They'll still be looking at the other patients. And, in turn, one of the major things that the scientists explain from the report is that they have been able to actually now understand that they can use, there's a scientific plasma, they can use plasma, as a treatment module, apart from, these other medicines that are being used. Of course, globally, the struggle to find a vaccine is still going on, and it may take even much longer than we anticipated. But, when we get hints like that, plasma from somebody who has recovered is very vital in treating the next patient, then I think to all of us generally, it's a big thing, in terms of dealing with COVID-19 for today and even for the future.
Well, sir, I now want to talk about something that many Ugandans have been keeping their eyes on. The cases that are being announced starting this week have slowly but surely shown that there's a level of community infection that has taken root with COVID-19. The number of community cases in the last week alone have gone up. In your understanding of covering this story from where we started to where we are now, would you say that the disease is now finally in the Ugandan community?
I can tell you that even the Ministry of Health, put it on record that we are going to see community cases, and they are going to, even increase on a daily basis. Not to worry people out there, but this should be treated as truth and fact. And in this, we should be extremely more careful in whatever we do, follow all the measures that have been put in place. But the reason for this is we are surrounded by, countries that do very little in terms of, testing. Some of them have not put up the stringent measures or regulations like we have done here. So even when you look at our curve, the first probably 1 month, it was flattening. But then, and the question people have now is that when we are tending to open up, the curve is shooting up. And that shouldn't be any, rocket science to understand, because you just need to look at where the cases are coming from. We stopped foreigners from, bringing in imported cases, but then our people who go into those countries are now the numbers that we see that are shooting up. And these are the same people, who managed to slip through the porous borders and then hide into the community, which is a very bad thing. You heard of a story yesterday where a gentleman was, picked from a ceiling somewhere in Kayunga with COVID-19. And if we have, that kind of attitude, I think we are doing a disservice to ourselves and to, everybody in the country.
Now, in terms of covering the story as health journalists, do you feel the authenticity of the numbers is accurate? Because the debate has now started to move to, are these numbers authentic? And how would you verify the authenticity of the numbers that the Ugandan public is receiving?
The question of numbers is a crazy one, I would say. And, we had the Ministry of Health admit that they don't know where some of those numbers are. The first time they were updating their website, and I did a quick math on the numbers that were on the website, the verified website of Ministry of Health. And there were about 70 people missing in between. So when I put the question to the permanent secretary, she did accept that there could be missing numbers, and those are people they think, first of all, are truck drivers who entered and exited the country. But also, it doesn't take away the fact that there are people who have switched off their mobile phones and want, contacts they can't follow up, and probably are COVID-19 positive. And here one would wonder, for how long are you going to hide with COVID-19? And one thing that actually came out in the report is that almost all the cases that were admitted, the first 56 cases, were asymptomatic. They had no symptoms. And there's, a belief that somebody could actually contract COVID-19 here in Uganda and heal without showing the signs and symptoms of the disease. So that is what is baffling the Ministry of Health. And the question of numbers, without a doubt, is one that we need to, look at critically. The fact that we had to even revise our own numbers, take away foreigners and, add who, subtract the other, which in actual sense doesn't make a lot of sense, because we went against the international regulations, and it could have some dangers on both ends for us and for our neighbors.
Walter, you are coming into the newsroom when the lockdown was on. And now that the lockdown has been partially lifted, do you think there's a big difference in the way that you're able to execute your duties on both occasions, post-lockdown and prior to the lockdown?
Yeah, definitely. Yes, and both positively and negatively, because when the lockdown had just been instituted, we had some of our colleagues, getting beaten by the security forces, which wasn't a good thing. I wasn't one of them, but it's never a good scenario to see your colleague being beaten, yet they are doing the right thing. These people are taking the wrong order. And of course, when it comes to things like, accessing interviews, that was made a bit easier, because everybody, or most of our sources, adopted the new trend. Just like we are talking right now, you're at your place, I'm in my place, and we are, having this chat, which will later be, taken to TV, which made the work a bit easier. But of course, we had to adjust. It became very hectic that some of our colleagues had to stay home. We are working with limited numbers, and it means I had to do the duty of myself and my colleague. Meaning, if a camera person does not come in today and will come in tomorrow, I'll have to do the duty of the camera person and myself, and the duty of an editor, edit my story. And that's where it becomes hectic. Now, on top of that, you have to add the factor that we have to shrink all that work into a limited time. So you have to be home by 7, so you don't fall into, the curfew time and all its, problems.
When we return, we'll talk to Margaret Vuchiri about the redesign of the Daily Monitor. For now, let's take a very short break. The new changing patterns of consumption of print media have brought changing with the face of designs for both newspapers at the New Vision and at the Daily Monitor. This week, the Monitor took on a fresh look, and we went behind the scenes to talk to the managing editor about this new fresh look of the Daily Monitor.
It's wasn't the night before. I think the lockdown, the partial lifting of the lockdown was done much earlier. So we had a week to plan. But even before that, we had, ideas. We had exchanged ideas with the other editors on what kind of stories would resonate with the public. So we had a planning meeting where we discussed, things like what people should expect on the day they drive their cars, the private cars, to the road, and what is required of them. Those things were communicated much earlier, but for someone who has been, indoors for a number of weeks, you just need that reminder that before you move out of your house, you need a mask. How many people should sit in the car? So we discussed things like that, but more importantly for us, we needed to find out whether we're following the guidelines. So it was the kind of story you do through photography mostly. So we sent out a team downtown, and you saw the picture we had on the front page, a congested, downtown Kampala with so many people. Obviously, social distancing is not being, observed, and shops were open, some shops, not all. But the key thing for me in particular was, for the team to find out if I have a shop and I'm sharing that space with other people, how many people, for instance, would be allowed into the shop? Would I then be allowed to, just get in as many customers as I can? So there are small things like that that people probably want to know. And also the kind of mask that people were expected to wear. There were questions, about, people, ordinary people leaving surgical masks to the medics. And if that were the case, then if I have it, is it illegal to drive, my car while wearing masks that are not, that are supposed to be for the medical team? These are seemingly very small things, but there are things that the public out there would want to know. So, but we also had a challenge because almost 3/4 of the newsroom was working remotely, and some were actually not working, they were on leave because most of our staff are freelance, the writers especially, and they could not, easily move around to get stories, and also some of them do not, quite frankly, have, the equipment to do work effectively from home. So we're really constrained. We had one news editor on duty, and most of the sub-editors were working from home, and there were immense challenges. So we navigated through that, but we wanted to make sure that despite the challenges, we could, in whatever way we could, give readers relevant stories.
You mentioned, you talked very briefly about the newsroom. Prior to the lifting of the lockdown, the partial lifting, and now after that lifting has happened, how has it changed the way the newsroom operates in terms of journalists coming in and going out?
It hasn't changed much in terms of numbers. One, because we were still expected to keep the numbers very low in the newsroom. Our newsroom is fairly congested, so it's only proper that the people who are working from home continue to work from home, and there are people who are on leave. So even after private cars are allowed to town, the numbers in the newsroom haven't changed. We still keep some people working from home. I think it was just on Thursday, we got in more people into the office because we're designing the newspaper. But from next week, they'll still have to go back and work from home.
Yeah. What has the interaction been like between journalists and public officials who give off public information, in terms of keeping journalists safe and secure, but also in terms of feeding this public demand for information during the lockdown?
During the lockdown, it was about getting information, because most journalists were working from home. they were interacting on phone with public officials. We didn't have many challenges in that area, but there are stories where you want a face-to-face meeting that obviously wasn't possible because even facilitation to move around was difficult, but also I do not think many public officials were willing to meet people due to various challenges. But in terms of the safety of journalists, we took precautions. For instance, getting home and getting to the field and things like that. We transported people from home to the office, but there are always concerns about their safety. Even contracting the virus, people raise these concerns. How safe are we, for instance, in these shared cars? But the guidelines are there, that what to do, wash your hands, sanitize, and those safety guidelines. But we had a small but dedicated team. They did their best under the circumstances, and we didn't have major complaints about lack of information. Also, that's because I think most of the stories were COVID related, so it was easier to get the officials on phone, but also most of the things, if you're talking about research, you're going to read information online, and then you call the scientists if you want to speak to them. But getting to hospitals and those areas was a bit restricted, so we didn't do much of that.
Let's now talk about your redesign. On Friday, the paper came out looking fresh and new, and a lot of work had been done behind the scenes. What first of all influenced the redesign of the Daily Monitor?
The redesign was a work in progress. We had planned to launch the new design early March. We had been planning that since December. The discussion started in December, and by January, we were working, on the design and how it would look, and it goes through several approvals. So by February, we thought, we'd be able to launch in early March, and then this virus started spreading, and things changed pretty quickly. And in March, it was obvious that we could not launch the new design. And what affected it so much was half of the staff, or 3/4 of the staff, were required to go and work from home. And as I stated earlier, many of them were constrained in terms of equipment and in terms of resources to move around. So a lot of the plans we had were put on hold. And that's because a redesign is not just about how different the paper looks. It's beyond the fonts and the masthead that you see. It should have ideally a better content that resonates with the public, content that is relevant, and content that readers are willing to pay for. Because if you don't do that, then you're giving them a raw deal. But we were, challenged in that area because we had started work to get content that is better, and then the lockdown constrained us a lot. But like they say, further, and that is what we are going to focus on, take the feedback and put it to you.
What has been the market perception of the paper after the redesign, or on Friday when it came out? What was the market perception of it?
I got feedback generally from people who sent me messages. I monitored social media, and I also got feedback from our marketing and circulation department. There's overall, appreciation of the design, that it looks good. But there are people who also, got to me and said, some of them like the content, but some of them are saying we want better content. And I appreciate that. And we need to take that seriously because it's the readers who consume this product. I don't buy a newspaper. So it should be unfair for me as an editor to impose, my views or ideas on a reader who is going to spend their money, because every day I get a free copy. So we are going to look through the feedback and see it and see where we can improve the product. A good design is good on the eye, but if a reader goes inside the paper, they should be able to get 1 or 2 articles that they can read and they can keep and refer to. If you don't do that as a newspaper, then you're going to become irrelevant, and that's not a good thing in a market where the digital disruption has grossly affected newspaper sales, and yet media houses are still struggling to get a workable profit model to sell the digital product. It's a work in progress, but it's not making enough money for media houses. So you need to balance between getting a profit model for digital, but also keeping your print relevant to the readers, because that is still where you get money, to sustain, the business. And also advertising is still more in the print section. So you need to listen to the reader, also invest in the journalists, and I can't stress that enough. You cannot sell a product or get good quality if you do not invest in the human resource. So that to me is very key, even when we take in the feedback and try to work on something better for the reader to pay. Because if you, even for the digital platforms, if you're going to put a paywall, people will only subscribe to your product if you are giving them something that they should be. That is worth their money. So a paywall should, be introduced, even as you invest in the journalists to do better work and give good journalism to the readers.
In case you missed it, at the start of the year, the New Vision also carried out a redesign of the newspaper. Then we spoke to their CEO, Robert Kapshenga, about the new consumption patterns and what they meant to the New Vision. But we also spoke to the managing editor of content at the Nation Media Group, Daniel Kalinaki, about the same, and this is what they had to say.
This is the time when all those years of selling newspapers, it's time to help the public. It's time to find affordable ways to give them the information. It's also the time when the investments in diversifying becoming a multimedia house helps, because the things you can't do in print, you have to do electronically. But most importantly, this is when your investment in your brand equity and credibility becomes important, because there's so much noise going on. Everybody is talking this. People are sharing all sorts of wild conspiracy theories on social media and messaging apps. People come back to us, the credible, respected media houses, for the truth. And this is the time we should give it to them. This is the time, the way doctors have risen to the occasion, this is the time journalists need to rise to the occasion by giving useful information that the public needs. Forget the tips. Everybody knows you've got to wash their hands. That's done. But they are also at home doing nothing. So a variety of subjects is going to arise. How do we recover from this? People are asking those questions. They want answers. If we don't give answers, they are going to go to charlatans pretending to be prophets and all sorts of doomsayers. And so they'll go there because we're not providing answers. I think we really, as media houses and as journalists, have a very powerful opportunity to be useful. And if we do that, we have a future. We will stay in people's lives. If we fail them, they will go to witch doctors.
Journalism must be relevant to audiences. You need to, if you take the long continuum of journalism, it starts out, 1500s, thereabouts, as just reportage of this happened, or it's a war report, 10 people killed, enemy territory, taken over, or shipping reports. It's just very basic, almost prosaic information. Then you go to, just covering beats. This is what happened in Parliament, this is what happened in the courts, and so on and so forth. So there's been a lot of that for, for centuries. We're now at a point whereby we need to give information that is functional and that is relevant, that is credible. People need to know, where should I take my kids to school? People need to know, which neighborhood should I live in? Should I go back to school for a second degree? Should I build a house? Should I rent a house? Should I buy a house? So yes, the news as we traditionally know it remains important, but we're now having to do a lot more functional information, but to do it with context, with nuance, and with, in a manner that is accessible and not just based on experts, but also on lived experience. So something like the COVID crisis is challenging us to tell stories differently. For instance, people are now having to do homeschooling. That's an opportunity to, how do you homeschool your kids? How do you manage being with your kids for a longer time than you traditionally do? How do you manage friction in relationships if people get cooped up in one space for a long time? And I think the journalism that survives is the journalism that will be able to identify the need and then serve it consistently.
As is the tradition of this show, we always leave you something to laugh about. And after the lifting of the lockdown, some people are not particularly happy about that presidential decision. We now see what they have to say about the lifting of the lockdown.